Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Kelly, founder and CEO of Servata. We're excited to be hosting another event in our long-running series, Masters of Brand Measurement. This is our first virtual event in the series. Usually we'd be in person, listening with cocktails in New York or San Francisco. Alas, times have changed. So this event's topic will be balancing brand metrics and sales metrics. I'm proud we've gathered a very impressive panel from the media analytics and marketing science community. Our masters represent prestigious brands, agencies, and platforms, so we can learn about this topic from different perspectives. A huge thank you to all panelists for taking time from their busy schedules to participate, and a huge thank you to all the attendees for doing the same. So we host this series not only for the obvious thought leadership benefit of hearing from experienced professionals in this space, but also for the benefit of connecting the analytics community for networking, career opportunities, or just friendship with fellow wonks. So while you can't see everyone on the line today, we are joined by over 100 executives, data scientists, marketers, analysts, technologists, and many more. Of course, we're sorry we can't gather in person this time, but we are very excited to resume this series in person when it's safe to do so. And lastly, for a super quick plug, if you don't know who we are, Servata is the brand intelligence platform. We offer software and data to plan, measure, and optimize brand marketing. Many of you here today use our platform to measure your campaign's brand outcomes, verify your campaign's targeting, or run a brand tracker. For those who don't know us, reach out. We'd be happy to talk. So I will turn it over to my colleague, John Stewart, Servata's VP of Measurement, to kick things off with the great panel. John, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. And welcome to everybody. We've got a great session for you guys today. The purpose of today's talk is to present expert thought leadership on brand campaign measurement. And what we're talking about today is balancing brand metrics and sales metrics to make decisions. And this is something that Servata knows about firsthand. It's something our customers, investors, partners ask us all the time about brand lift versus sales lift versus MTA. And the one thing that they ask is, hey, don't all of these measure a campaign? And if so, can't we just use one of them? And historically, incrementality measurement and attribution measurement were blurred. But fortunately, lately, the distinction between incrementality and attribution measurement is being openly discussed. So you've got bodies like the ARF, ICOM, ANA, and others doing sessions, webinars, highlighting the value of this idea called incrementality. But that's the critical distinction, right? I don't think I need to tell most of you about the power of attribution. Many of you are very sophisticated at using it to assign credit to paid channels, but the distinction here is recognizing that it does not purely explain whether advertising was effective. So that being said, we've assembled a great group of experts from brands, media companies, and agencies, and we're going to do a deep dive on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each one of our esteemed panelists, and then we'll get the discussion going. So up first is Bunmi Onibokun. Why don't you introduce yourself, Bunmi?
Hi, everyone. Bunmi Onibokun is my name. I lead media planning and analytics for PepsiCo's Juice Plus portfolio of products.
Thank you, Bunmi. And up next is Emily Weinstein.
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily. I'm with Seventh Generation, one of the Unilever portfolio of brands. And I work on the consumer and market insights team for our media and integrated marketing group.
Thanks, Emily. And Jennifer Knuckles.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Knuckles, Knuckles just like your fist. I'm coming from Hulu. I've been there about 4 years now. Building out our attribution research practice, working closely with our brand partners as well. So excited to be here.
Thank you, Jen. Up next, Costa Sculicarus.
Yes, hi everyone. Costa Sculicarus. I'm with OMD. I lead an ad tech, MarTech consulting practice.
Great, thank you, Kosta. And last but not least, Jackie Mockridge-Mattina.
Hey folks, I am Jackie Mockridge-Mattina. I oversee the Consumer Insights and Analysis Group at 360i. We're responsible for unlocking deep understanding of consumer motivations and mindsets that fuel media and brand strategy.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. We're really happy to have you all here, and we're going to dive in. One of the things I think we would like to start with is a little bit more broadly, right? So generally, what we want to start to focus on is understanding from a couple of the brands on the panel, how are you guys thinking about brand KPIs and brand outcome these days? So wanted to get your thoughts on there. Maybe start, Emily, with you, if you want to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think we are really focused on making sure that the brand KPI matches the job to be done within whatever we're trying to accomplish with the campaign, and making sure that that aligns with a strong measurement program, which I think in a lot of cases has been a struggle to have the right tools in your toolkit. But increasingly over the last couple of years, we've been exploring some new great tools and have found ways to really move the needle on the brand KPIs like awareness and consideration that in a way we didn't in the past.
Great, thanks, Emily. And one thing I forgot to mention is that if you're an attendee, you can use the Q&A chat function, and I'll do my best to either address or clarify things as we're kind of chatting, or we can kind of skip to the end, and we'll give you a chance to get your questions answered there. So please use that feature, and we'll try to get to everything we can. Bunmi, interested in your take on how you and the folks at PepsiCo might be thinking about brand KPIs.
Yeah, thanks for passing the torch over. I think first, we are a CPG company, right? Our products range anywhere from like a $3 bag of chips to a $10 pack of PepsiCo, the drink. I think the key thing for us is our category is highly competitive, right? So we have to be able to react to changes in the marketplace, changes in perceptions on our products as quickly as possible. So it's very, very important to us that we look at, one is our key outcome, which is, we're trying to drive sales, right? For our products and build a business. But from a consumer perspective, we're trying to build love for our products with our consumers. So for us, the key outcomes we're looking at is, okay, from a media side, what are we doing to drive, lift? But on the flip side, what are we also doing to drive brand love or connections with our brands? So while there are a host of other metrics we track, I think we're trying to standardize on those two and consistently track them and consistently build our ability to deliver on those key outcomes.
Great, thanks, Bunmi. And so, Emily, you had mentioned a little bit about some of the challenges that come along with this. Are you guys thinking about sort of looking at some of the industry research and figuring out how you're going to allocate dollars between brand building and sales activation? Is it a 60-40 rule? How might you be solving this puzzle?
Yeah, of course, I think you have to put a little love into each bucket, right? And thankfully, I think we've got, great guidance from our media agency, and, we really have the benefit of being able to put, some dollars into that sort of brand love bucket and building, the longer term metrics up, and then, you know, you always also have to, you know, put some attention into the short-term sales. So it's certainly, you know, it's certainly a give and take of, you know, how you allocate the dollars. And I think for a brand like 7th Gen, it's really important that we spend a lot of time on that, you know, longer term brand building too. And don't, you know, don't miss out on sharing our mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Kosta, I'm curious, from the agency's perspective, how are you guys thinking about building out these metrics, and how that can inform the you know, the allocation of these dollars between these two activities?
Yeah, sure, John. Number one, I agree with Emily. It's definitely all about love. And, you know, obviously being a little bit biased, being from Hellenic descent, you know, as a Greek philosopher, Socrates said, it's more important of the questions that we ask than the answers that we proffer. So when we think about that love and that allocation between short-term and long-term, I think it's important that this brand research is validated. And obviously Bennett and Field's 60-40 allocation that's been out there, I think it's important that there's got to be a thorough understanding of the problem set and really identify some hypotheses and put those experiments in the market. And that experimentation, you got to have patience, because what we're talking about is, you know, short-term and long-term. And that long-term is going to go beyond a fiscal year. It's going to go beyond 12 months. So when we think about putting that test schema together, you know, clients got to have the patience. They got to have the media spend. They got to have the executive sponsor, because sometimes these short-term metrics are not going to be in alignment to what you're going to see over time. So I definitely agree with Emily that it's about love. It is about this research, but I do think you got to set this up, and you got to set it up over time.
Absolutely. And Kosta, can you maybe, without giving too much away, talk a little bit about some of the experiments that you've run in these areas? Maybe give our audience a little bit of background on what they might be able to take a look at and evaluate. I think you went mute somehow.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll definitely cover that off. You know, when I look at various experimentations that I've seen over time, you know, both on the data side when I was at Experian in their innovation lab, and then also at Nielsen within their innovation lab, some of the research happening right now and some of the experiments have to do with access, share of voice, share of market. And in order to really validate that theory, the test schema has got to be done at a local level. You got to use old-fashioned match market type methodology. You got to really have some syndicated tools to understand your competitive spend and where you are in that equilibrium to keep those ratios consistent. So you're making adjustments to spend on a monthly basis. And there's a little bit of game theory within your competitive set, taking a look at what the others are going to do when they start tracking the same syndicated data that you're getting access to. So what we're seeing is, you know, a long-term approach to these experiments. And we're seeing that it's a tough sell, because you're not going to see the immediate gratification in the short-term results.
Yep, so true. So Jen, I wanted, you know, at Hulu, I'm sure you guys have, you have a lot of exposure to many different brands with a bunch of different objectives. So one of the questions that we were hoping you could help us answer is if advertisers might be hurting brand building by over-focusing on short-term sales, or hurt short-term sales by over-focusing on brand building. Are these two things necessarily in sync, or is there a trade-off?
I think it actually goes along with what Kosta was just saying. We find we have a mixture of advertisers. Some, for example, are in the DTC brand realm, where they're instant short-term sales are the immediate goal. But sometimes it's a one and done test, and they take that, for what it is. And we often have to advise them that, this is just a snapshot in time, and it also isn't capturing necessarily what's happening with your brand. And so there's more testing to be done, especially on the branding piece to get at that long haul, to help grow your base, your customer base. And so I think it's a balance, right? You don't want to, it's almost like a diet. You could do some of these crash diets and they'll work for a period of time. But really what's going to get you those long-term results and maintain is, a healthy lifestyle, incorporating exercising, and the same thing's true with your media plan. So, you definitely you need to incorporate these short-term tactics, but, when it comes to your creative and your audience target, that's going to be challenging to grow if you're all in just this short snapshot in time. So I think you've got to keep growing. You got to keep thinking about your brand. And the same thing's true if you're overdoing it on the branding piece, right? You don't want to spray and pray too much either. So I think it's a mixture of figuring out how do I get these short-term gains, but keep growing my brand over time.
And John, on that point, just to add to what Jennifer mentioned, when you think about that diet example, which is a good one, the activity that is most effective long-term may be underperforming in the short term.
Right.
So, having the patience to stay the course with the diet or with this paradigm of short-term versus long-term, it's not easy. Hence why I'm still trying, to shed that last 10.
100%.
Yeah. And, especially when there's so much pressure these days for short-term measurement on, whatever the team might have as set as KPIs. Jackie, wanted to get your perspective on, maybe from the agency world or maybe from your past experience, what you think about this trade-off.
Yeah, sure. First, I can say I hope nobody else on this call is following my diet nowadays, which consists primarily of wine. But I'm going to take a different take on this too. And coming from an analytics background, I absolutely agree in testing. However, I now lead an audience group, and I would suggest that the most thoughtful way to approach the challenge of the appropriate ratio between brand building and performance media is really taking an audience first approach. And we have to ask ourselves, who am I trying to compel and to engage and to convert? So all of you may already have a segmentation of sorts on hand. If not, I'd highly recommend doing one. And through that, you can identify your priority personas who are going to drive this lifetime value and evangelize your brand, which will, of course, fuel tons of earned impressions and word of mouth and free brand building. So once you've identified your focus, then you figure out, what is your brand awareness or sentiment or share problem with this particular slice of the population? What's their barrier for getting them to buy? Is it apathy? Is it commoditization, or is it sheer price comparison? And so once you've unlocked that answer with the population or the segment that really means something for this long-term growth, then you can start attacking the problem of what is the appropriate ratio.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I think in the old days, you had a couple of choices. You could do prime time for reach, or you could do local for specific. And, now with layers of data, you have opportunities to turn knobs. So I wanted to get the brand perspective on this question. I think it's an important one, talking about, I know that Emily and Bunmi, you guys have already talked about some of the trade-offs, but, wanted to ask you guys how you might be asking your agency partners or measurement partners, and you know, how you might take all the information you've got at your disposal to bring these things together and solve the problems of trade-off.
Well, let me jump in and say what Jackie and Jennifer and the team have said. They've been spot on, right? I think the only addition I'd make to that is, for us, I mean, I lead a portfolio of products, so each product in the portfolio has a specific level in terms of its penetration within the marketplace, right? There's some products that are more well-known than others, right? So to go back to answer the specific question, absolutely you can over-focus on one thing, maybe short-term versus long-term. For maybe an established product, there's a tendency to just focus on driving the sales short-term because you've already built that brand equity. It's all about balance, right? And for new products, a product that's just nascent, new innovation launching into the marketplace, definitely there's a tendency to also focus on brand building, which is key, of course, because nobody knows about the brand, but you should also drive short-term sales. I think the key, of course, as I said, is, as others have said, and I'm also reiterating now, is focus on what your objectives are from a product growth perspective. But to navigate those trade-offs, I think I keep coming back to, you know, somebody threw out diet, so I'll use the losing weight analogy here going forward, if that's okay. You know, to lose weight, you have to really measure yourself on a scale first, right? See where you are, right? And then plan accordingly, and then continue to measure, right? So in this context, right, definitely understanding the tactics and the systems you use to drive short-term sales versus brand equity is key. And then beyond that, you balance out your media plan, your consumer engagement plans to meet both, and then you measure on the back end, and then you rinse and repeat and continue to learn along those lines. So the key is setting goals, measuring, and learning along the way.
Great. Emily, do you want to add to this topic before we kind of move into some tactics?
Yeah, I echo what Bunmi said, that, you know, that it's, you have to keep in mind if you're balancing a portfolio of products and, you know, how you manage a new product entrant into the market. And, you know, in a lot of cases, we have to think more specifically about, you know, shorter term sales when it comes to our product marketing. And then we really focus more on sort of our master brand and building brand love across our portfolio when we think about the longer term metrics. And I think that's sort of how we try to allocate, is, you know, getting the product benefits in front of someone at that product level, but then, you know, not losing sight of the halo effect that you can get from building that longer term equity in your brand.
Yep. Yeah. And I think even in the brand funnel, even in brand performance KPIs, there's definitely nuance, right? Because we were asked to measure a brand that was brand new, and it had less than 1% awareness, aided awareness. And, you know, there was a very spirited conversation over, should they start to look at other metrics? You know, knowing that eventually they wanted to sell the product, but, you know, how do you balance that when, you know, when very few people are even aware of it? So even within brand KPIs, this is a big topic. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper into some of tactically what folks might be able to do to start to solve these problems, right? And so, Jackie, I wanted to start with you and get the agency perspective on, you know, what are advertising, are advertisers that you work with, are they still paying a lot of attention to delivery metrics like reach and frequency, knowing that generally, or betting generally that video and good creative can drive brand lift? Or are you seeing, when we think about the pendulum, more time on brand outcome metrics like increasing awareness or increasing favorability, things like that?
Delivery metrics are still top of mind, but actually for more of a different purpose. So the questions our clients are asking are not, did I get what I paid for, or how many human beings were exposed to my brand? And instead, they're analyzing these metrics at an audience or even an individual consumer level. Now that CDPs are becoming more prevalent and we're starting to think about people-based marketing. And ultimately, they're trying to understand, what is the story that my brand is telling them? So not how many times did I reach them, but what actually the message and the position did I bring them along? So are my words, my tone, my positioning cohesive and appropriate to their stage in their purpose, in their entire purchase journey? So of course, this doesn't mean that their brand outcome metrics are any less vital when we're understanding how consumers are absorbing the advertiser's narrative. And in fact, I would recommend that we expand the portfolio of where we're gathering these metrics. So for some of our clients, we scrape thousands of ratings and reviews and feed them into a natural language processor to quantify and track brand sentiment and consideration. So all in all, delivery metrics are still prized. They're being used for even more now than they used to be. But now these delivery metrics and the brand awareness metrics are actually a roll up of a lot of data points for which we can leverage large data sets as well as research.
Yeah, you mentioned tone, and it's really interesting how tone has become has just come to the forefront during the pandemic, right? So I've never in my life seen so many brands come and ask, hey, what should I be doing about tone? So we actually did a little bit of research in this area, and we found, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, consumers were really turned off by business as usual messages, right? Just, buy our thing and, become aware of our product. And they really wanted messaging that was either going to talk about how their thing was safe or better, or what they're doing to help consumers and things like that. So I think, this is where not only do brands have to think about their own brand, but be very in tune with what's going on in the world and sensitive to what consumers are after. Bunmi, any perspective from the PepsiCo?
Well, I totally agree with the last speaker, Jackie, on making sure where an audience first approach is typically the best thing to do. I think what I'd add to that, specific to this question, is those delivery metrics, reach frequency, viewability, etc. Right? I mean, let's be honest, they're very easy to come by, right? They're tracked on a quick, fast basis. Like, you can execute a campaign today, like tomorrow you start to get results on those metrics. So because they're fastest come by, we typically optimize the campaign based on those metrics. And the idea is we're optimizing to those delivery metrics, but the outcome metrics are the final goal, right? So that's how we're balancing both. I wouldn't say one is more important. It's more like one ladders up to the other, as opposed to one takes priority or is more important than the other, right? So I think, as a business, I mean, there's some things you come by quickly that you should definitely leverage to improve your performance. And sales lift, brand lift, even media ROIs are harder, take more time to come by. More lag periods are required to get to those. But if you set those as your outcome metrics and set the other delivery metrics as your optimization metrics, I think you can do quite a lot to drive performance for your business.
Yeah. This idea of laddering is, I think, really important in bringing, other perspectives of different types of outcome measurements together in order to drive brand. Sorry, Jackie, I think I may have cut you off.
Yeah, no, it's good. Bunmi, I wanted to unpack that a little bit because I think that's really interesting, especially as we're thinking about like the audience first approach there. because in some cases you can never get to those outcome metrics if you don't satisfy the delivery metrics. For example, we did a project last year for a cult hot sauce following, and there was a section of the group of the prime audience that didn't really understand what was different about the brand in order to even get them to store to buy it. So, so I wonder whether they do need to be looked at as pillars in and of themselves instead of one laddering into the other, because in some ways the delivery metrics are a goal in even to get that consumer into the consideration set. How do you feel about that?
Well, the way I agreed that they are important on their own. I still feel that some kind of connection has to be made at the end. So slight difference of opinion there. Doesn't mean what you're doing maybe, is incorrect or anything like that. I just feel like at the end of the day, and I'm speaking from a media only perspective, right? I'm executing media, right? At the end of the day, our media is meant to drive certain things, right? So those outcomes are always front and center. Like, what did it do there? And how did, the next question is, how do we get what we're hoping it does to do better, right? So still going back to what I said, which is those, reach, frequency, and viewability, especially given it's planned from an audience level. So we're looking at those from did the people we plan to see this, did they actually see it, and so on and so forth. So that's being built into the plan. But at the end of the day, I am still insisting, that it ladders up to key outcomes for our business. And those outcomes, is I think the point you made is that they're not easy to come by in all industries, right? So it's an as best as possible scenario that I'm throwing out there, right? Because sales lift is not something you can get for everything. But brand lift, you can, it's a questionnaire, right? So there are different ways you can get to different things. At the end of the day, just have goals, set goals, and plan against them, and and reevaluate post the fact is how I see things.
Yeah, John. I would like to add what Bunmi just mentioned. I think you have leading indicators and then lagging, and when you think about the explanatory variables of the delivery metrics, if you're laser focused on those outcomes are very much validated and they're very deterministic. When we start getting into some delivery metrics, we haven't talked about, privacy compliance. We haven't talked about, data gaps. We haven't talked about, the modeling of certain delivery metrics. It's important that we focus on the end, but also understand how there's some leading indicators that will be explanatory variables once you start doing attribution and you start doing, your measurement framework.
Yeah, that's a great point. And while we're talking tactics here, we've got a great question coming from the audience here. So I was wondering if you guys if any of you guys want to handle this. It's, do you use different creative for brand building versus driving sales?
I'm not on the brand side, but we actually we're working on a creative best practices to kind of get at a question like this, because we're finding that there's a lot of disconnect between the two, thinking like I can use the same branding creative that I can use for end outcomes. Whereas with the outcomes creatives, we might be seeing something else might work. So one of the examples we've been seeing is, we'll have an advertiser where the outcome they're trying to drive is in-store visits or online web conversions, right? But there's no call to action in their creative. And so we'll, as a brand, like Hulu will be held against this metric of, did you drive people to my site? But we're not even telling consumers to do that. And so it's interesting to see that there's this disconnect with some of the creative and how they're being built. So it's a hot topic, I think, for us, even just trying to understand that and communicate what we're seeing, different brands that are, what they're doing on our platform and like what's been working or not working. But that is an interesting topic about how they've been kind of separate. And then some that do it right, kind of bring it back together into that one cohesive message.
Yeah, I just want to add to that because that's so right. I think at the end of the day, every interaction with a consumer is an interaction that at some level drives short-term sales lift, and on some level drives long-term brand building. Some more so than what Jennifer mentioned on testing and learning to figure out what works best for each one is critical. So yes, yes and no, I guess is the answer to the question. That was just mentioned.
I mean, I think it really does have to be distinct, because you have to go back to what you're trying to accomplish with that piece of creative, or with that, piece of the campaign. And like Jennifer said, if you're expecting something to drive short-term sales, but you're not giving, a specific call to action, then, it's just not going to be as effective as, as it might have been if you were clear about, what takeaway message you want the consumer to have at the end of the day. And maybe just to build on what Jackie's saying, you also really have to have, if you're doing it right, you should have a different piece of creative for the audience that you're speaking to as well. So you may, I think of it sort of as a funnel. You may have, brand building and short-term sales objectives at the top, and then you come down to, and within that, who are my audiences? And then within that, what is the right creative to ladder up to all of those objectives within the campaign?
That's also where understanding your audience becomes so interesting, because if you've done the research, you can really unpack and unlock what are their motivating factors. It's like, what is going to make this somebody make a decision or prioritize or deploy money and attention in one place or another? And custom research helps with that. I mean, social listening helps with that. There's a lot of places that if you spend the time and the resources, you can develop a creative message that will resonate, which ultimately puts you a step ahead in that instant where they see you and 4 other ads on the same page.
I couldn't agree more, and I think if I were to offer my own opinion, it's good creative is good creative. It's going to be memorable, and it could potentially create a favorable association with that brand, but you need that call to action, right? In order to marry the two. Great discussion.
Can I throw this out there? I mean, you don't always need a call to action, especially if your need is to, if sales is your goal. Yes, you need a call to action around that. But if building your brand, you don't necessarily need to have an explicitly stated call to action.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And John, to your point about memorability, when you think about short term, you think about more rational, more price elasticity dialogue. When you think about long term, you're getting into emotional. So that planning process between media and creative, if that's integrated, a lot of this audience first, short term, long term, call to action, it should manifest itself. So that's why, an integrated approach to both short term and long term, as well as creative and media, as well as, the dollars, upper funnel, lower funnel, that all should come out if you have a very integrated, cohesive planning process. And that's where you see, in order to get bigger, you got to get smaller. And that smaller also comes with the efficiency of the workflow.
That's a great segue into another good question that we got from the group, which is, what are some good short-term proxy metrics for brand measurement? So if we're thinking short-term, what would you guys measure?
I can take one of these. We use social listening a lot, and I nodded to ratings and reviews as well. So if you have the technology and you have the tools such as Quid, NetBase, et cetera, you can bring in all those data points across Amazon, Jet, Costco, et cetera, and easily see how people are talking about the brand and the sentiment of the overall product. And also, whether people are evangelizing. So that's typically an agile way to get a pulse very quickly on whether your advertising efforts are really moving the needle, and whether natural, organic, earned buzz is happening.
Yeah, in addition to that, we're also using short-term sales lift studies and just doing, of course, the attribution models and media ROI, marketing mix models to get a sense of the short-term impact. Short-term is described by we advertised, and then within a few weeks of seeing the ad, you went and bought product, right? So slightly be different for other kinds of companies, other types of businesses, but for CPG, for PepsiCo, that's what we're looking at as kind of ultimate short-term metrics.
Yeah, and I think, Bunmi, you and Emily both work in categories that are highly competitive for share, and could be viewed as conversion focused. And you can correct me on that if I've misspoken, but we've got a question here that says, hey, what if your key competitor is 100% conversion focused? They're starting to win share as a result. How does that impact your brand's short-term versus long-term balance decision?
Well, we have a very strong competitor in our field, right? Name withheld, but it goes back to the point of balance, right? I mean, if our key competitor starts ramping up efforts to win share, there's a share battleground that we're fighting that we have to win there also. So we adjust accordingly, right? But that doesn't mean we entirely lose focus on the long-term brand building perspective. So, that's, I guess, the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful not to be too reactionary, because, those short-term tactics may win them share for the short term. But if you continue, if you stay the course and, stay on the healthy living diet that Jackie introduced us to earlier, then, ultimately, that those will pay off in the end. But it is hard. It's hard when the competition is nipping at your heels.
Yeah. And we have talked a little bit about this trade-off. One of the things that is typically a longer play that we haven't really talked about yet today is brand tracking, right? So Jackie, I was wondering if maybe you had a perspective on what sort of unique sources might be leveraged in this area that, mining brand awareness and favorability in supplementing longer term brand tracking studies.
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of surveys for quick turn quantitative surveys to just understand just general words and sentiment and vocabulary associated with the brand, because I think brand favorability is not just positive or negative anymore. Your brand is a personality, and that's something that should be tracked and measured. I did mention social listening before, and one thing I think is really interesting about social listening is that you typically can boil the comment down to an emotion. So whether somebody is an advocate, an evangelist, a loyalist, consideration, and if you normalize that, you can track that against your competition. And we call it a social intensity score. So that's something that you can measure over time as well. And then the other thing I mentioned is looking at consumer chatter. So any kind of conversation that's happening online can be scraped and can be cut and leveraged to understand whether your brand favorability is increasing or if it's stagnant.
Excellent. And so Jen, wanted to kind of get your the media perspective here on whether you're seeing, of course, you guys have a very sort of brand friendly platform, but wondering if you're seeing a lot of advertisers paying more attention to some of these like emotional outcomes like favorability, or if they're more focused on media tactics, reach frequency, viewability, brand safety, et cetera, or if there is even a trade-off.
I think there's definitely a mix amongst our advertisers. So, with Hulu, we try to at least have the capability. I mean, someone mentioned this earlier, but just measurement gaps, and for not every category or every client can be measurable in the same way. And so we try to make sure that we're diversified and can measure exactly what they're getting after. We'll have a lot of brands that are still interested in those reach and frequency metrics. But one of the things we try to consult with them is, and this is a concept everyone was just talking about, was, what's your end game? What's the end outcome that you're trying to drive? Is it awareness? Is it, end sales? Is it website visitation, which is a little bit more upper funnel than even some of the sales metrics, right? But still lower. So I think it's, once we deduce what their end goal is, I think that's when we can advise on reach and frequency. And a lot of times we'll use some of custom research that Bunmi was mentioning, sales effect studies, if that's their end goal, to then advise on the right reach and frequency for that audience that they were hitting, and kind of like understand the audience if that's their end goal, and then advise on reach and frequency from there. So it's kind of that interplay with all of those different components to get at what they're after,
Yeah. And one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about today, Jackie, you mentioned a little bit when talking about, your social listening, but it's this idea of sentiment. We've got a few different questions around sentiment from the group. So how do you guys think about that? I kind of see that as a third layer, right? You're thinking about performance brand metrics, you're thinking about sales metrics, and then you've got sentiment. Any thoughts on where this fits in, how you're looking at it and thinking about it?
I mean, sentiment is a tough nut to crack, right? And I think for us, natural language processing does help a little bit for us to be able to track like how consumers are feeling. But ultimately, a lot of our work is done manually. So a lot of understanding what consumers are saying are run through human eye, because there's an art along with the science.
Yeah, this is a question that back in my Nielsen days, we worked on a lot. And what we found was the majority of consumers will be sentiment neutral about brands. So what you're really talking about is your top end and bottom end of people that are familiar with your brand. So I always think about sentiment as something in a very crowded space. Like the insurance category is something I always think about, because there's probably like 9 to 10 different, like very large players with huge media budgets. And so for something where it's a very crowded space and you're only making a decision on whether to get that thing, I don't know, once a year, once every 10 years, that's where sentiment can be a big factor. But I also think it's something that advertising, it's a big lift for advertising alone to accomplish. A lot of it is the part of the brand is your experience in using that brand. And so it ties into customer service and price and everything else. So, okay, well, thank you guys for that. We are about 10 minutes from time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a little bit of future state here, right? So when we think about brand building versus driving sales, short-term and long-term, what would you guys say is kind of the holy grail, right? How does measuring all of these things impact the long-term? What are you guys doing, or what would you want to be done to kind of, in a perfect world, marry these two and know that you're making the right decisions? So Jackie, we'll start with you.
Well, I do believe, contrary to kind of teasing Bunmi a little bit earlier, I do think that they are a flywheel. So you need to be thinking about optimizing them together, and they absolutely need to be tied together. I worked in multi-touch attribution many years ago, and the good news is that it typically only takes about 5 years to build an MTA and be able to build some sort of model that will show how upper funnel KPIs and lower funnel KPIs interrelate. So it's not nearly as daunting as it used to be, but because they're both huge components to the overall consumer perception and holistic experience with your brand, they need to be looked at together in the future.
Yeah, John, I'd just like to add to that comment that Jackie made about attribution. You know, what I've seen in terms of some experiments, when you start looking at brand lift studies or long-term brand equity studies, when you start looking at them making its way into the attribution model, like actually adjusting the coefficients based on what you see, either through always on or through these episodic stimulus that happen based on seasonality of the brand, I do see that as a potential best practice. So you're incorporating these lift studies and those Nielsen metrics that you mentioned about favorability and awareness, and then you're doing some manual intervention. And I think to Jackie's point, it is about, you know, science and obviously some art. And the art is going to come with, you know, adjusting those knobs based on those data gaps, based on, you know, some of the coverage lacks that we have on all the channels. So I do see an intertwining between, you know, lower funnel, very deterministic sales metrics, and then some of the, you know, brand resonance and brand equity studies that are incorporated.
Yeah. For me, I mean, you know, I don't think anybody has a holy grail here. I mean, what I try to do is, okay, understand correlations between those short-term, those quick turn metrics, which is the brand metrics, and, you know, even the funnel, the performance, media performance metrics like reach frequency. Understand which of them can I see drives my short-term sales, right? And, you know, there's a selfish benefit for that, in that I'm just trying to say, how do I get early indicators of what's going to happen to in terms of driving short-term sales lift. So that's what I am using or part of what I'm using the metrics for. I think, Jackie, you're right that, hey, they're both important and they should be looked at, you know, as separate pillars, but I'm still trying to, in addition to that, I'm still trying to link to them, because at the end of the day, right, you're from a consumer's perspective, you know, the idea is if I can get the consumer to love my brand, you know, I can, you know, then the consumer is also buying my brand and continuing to engage with my brand. So, you know, from one level, it feels like they should be connected in some way, and that's the connection I'm trying to understand as best as possible and use to drive short-term performance for my brand. So
Bunmi, how, you know, for maybe some of the brands in your portfolio that are a bit newer or nascent, how long on average does it take to see brand building or brand love efforts show up in your KPIs?
Ooh. That's a very tough question. You know, because, you know, first we have to build distribution with our retailers. So it's, you know, before we can truly start to get level set measures, some brands more quickly than others. Some brands are more successful on, you know, have a steeper curve than others. But I'd say, you know, it's at least a year, you know, before we start to see a true level set of where the brand is from a brand perspective. And that's just related to the nature of our business, which is largely, you know, in-store sales, brick and mortar store sales.
Yeah. I think it also ties into what are some of the leading indicators, right? So we always say that you know, as a brand that might be not as well known or new, you can always start to drive things like aided awareness, and in particular ad recall, right? So people may not be very familiar with your brand or have much opinion on it, but they might think like, oh yeah, I've seen that, right? And I think those are some of the things to really focus on early on in a brand's life cycle, just to get, you know, and then potentially message awareness would be another early metric to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we've got just a couple of minutes to wrap here. Let's see, any other comments on my last question from the group around this idea of the holy grail of linking brand building and driving sales? Okay. You know, okay, so we've got time for one last question. And I think I'm gonna throw you guys a curveball because I brought this up briefly earlier in the call, but are norms still relevant in this pandemic market?
It depends on the norm, I think. You have to take a real critical eye at, you know, what might have shifted because of the pandemic and what is sort of evergreen true, and just be very careful that you're not assuming that things are going to stay the same or that things have shifted. You know, I think we're all working harder than ever to make sure we understand how consumers' perceptions and you know, what kind of tone they expect out of us. So don't assume, you know, I guess is the takeaway for me.
We're living through unprecedented times. I don't think, you know, any of us are old enough to have dealt with another pandemic in the past, right? So right now, I wouldn't say there are any norms per se, right? We're living, this is an outlier, right? In as far as I know. So we're all dealing with that and trying to figure out new norms based on the outlier that's occurring right now.
Yeah, thank you guys for that perspective. I think for me, I think this is a good reminder to really look at incremental lift in whatever you're measuring, because you might find that nobody wants to purchase your you know, in certain categories because of the pandemic, but if you're measuring against a control group or against a baseline, then generally everything would be down. So I think incremental is still, it has a lot of value in this, even in this new world. Well, thank you to each of you for your expert opinions on these topics. And thanks for everyone who's attending. That's a wrap. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think, and I hope to do this in person with you guys, hopefully soon.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.